This is great. We're curious. We've done this at a couple of conferences, and it's been really interesting in terms of weaving together some of what we've heard, questioning some things, pushing some ideas further. And so maybe I'll just start off with some opening remarks from each of you in terms of your reflections on the day. Kylie.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me here. So there's lots of things for me that have really piqued my interest throughout the day. I think one of the early talks from Alexander around mentioning cultural competency, and that should be something that we're all accountable for, especially as leaders. That really resonated with me. Nazma's work around including traditionally underrepresented groups, and I think I'll talk some more to that later. And just a shout out to Hilary. So Hilary in the Ontario Digital Service, very much aligned with my work in the UK with the government digital service there, and their digital service standard is a really powerful tool, and I'm looking forward to seeing that doing some good work here in Canada.
Excellent. Pamela?
I'll say thanks first before I start. I know all of you are probably dying to get to your weekend in a snowstorm, so we'll try to make this interesting and worth your while. I'll start by saying I'm really grateful to have the chance to have been here all day. It's an interesting task when you're charged with trying to roll up comments for the day. You have to listen really actively the entire day. I was delighted, and this may be the narrowness of my network, but there are lots of people who I knew of who I hadn't met in person who I got to hear speak today. And to me, that's always a good sign that when you go somewhere and you meet people you've never met before, it's a sign that you're reaching out and engaging. So I was very glad to hear from a range of people, and I think that one of my overarching takeaways for today is just there's so much power when you let people have the space and you give them the capacity that they need to do the work that needs to get done. Instead of doing it on behalf of people, Nazma talked about not planning with people, or planning with people, not for. There was a lot of power and diversity in terms of techniques and ideas and needs that need to be filled. And so I think there's a lot of room to talk about that as we wrap up the day.
Excellent. So you can add your questions as well for Kylie and Pamela, but when it comes to digital inclusion, what keeps you up at night?
That's a simple one for me. So what keeps me up at night is inherent bias, and I think we have a responsibility all to be aware of our own bias. So coming from government service background, I think especially in public service design, that responsibility is even more so on us. And often I see that digital inclusion and digital diversity is an add-on or something nice to have, or maybe something that a leader wants to talk about as something to show off about. Whereas really that should be the underpinning of the way that we do service design. And I think we should all make sure that we're understanding both the ways in which we are privileged and underprivileged.
Pamela?
For me, it's the lack of data about connectivity and access. Sorry, excuse me. I think it's shocking, given government's move towards digitization, that we don't have good granular data about who's online, where, how, and under what circumstances. And I think that, I don't know how tomorrow will wrap up, but, be it resolved that that's not we can't go forward without the data. We have the ability to gather the data. We need to set the terms and conditions in which that data is gathered, but we can't effectively do our work if we can't see what's missing quantitatively. We can't use evidence to inform practice without the data. And it's, we use the census as a platform for all kinds of policy and institutional change. We need similar data to really address digital inclusion, because we won't know what to push on other than going by anecdotes, and we need something bigger and more powerful than that.
Absolutely. Anecdotes. We hear so many of them.
Lived experience is really important, and it's one piece of it, but we need that plus big data sets to be able to move forward.
So Kylie, can you do an unofficial comparison in terms of Ontario, UK, or Canada, UK more broadly, in terms of what you're seeing?
Absolutely. I think I'd like to start by saying that whilst the UK is probably further ahead in terms of formal accessibility and inclusion, my experience so far in the last, what has been 10 days in Canada, is that Canadians themselves are very personally inclusive. So that's a really big plus for me. In terms of comparison, so there's been lots of talk about the UK being fairly far ahead and having lots of investment. One thing that we have been quite good at, and to your point, Pamela, around data, is really quantifying the economic impact of inclusion. And there was some work done recently, which I can share afterwards, looking into that. So in terms of things like employability and ability for people to earn more money means they pay more taxes, ability for people to communicate, so work remotely is more inclusive in itself. But how do you put a monetary value on that? And there's been a lot of good work to kind of get a benchmark that we're then able to measure impact of kind of efforts towards improving that. And that's really something that speaks to the current government, and it speaks to everyone's kind of motivation to move forward. If you underpin it with that sort of monetary value, it's helpful. So just to give an example, it was estimated in the UK that if we invest enough money, so I think it's around 1.5 billion was estimated, in making sure that everyone has access and basic digital skills by 2025, so that 1.5 billion cost would give us a return of almost 10 times that. So for every £1 we invest, that's £10 back to the economy. So that is a kind of particularly helpful thing. And finally, I'd just say, again, pointing to Ontario Digital Service and the Digital Service Standard, it's great, and we've talked a lot today about policies around accessibility. For me, the one thing that the UK had, which it did pretty well, was those standards and policies were tied to spend control. So that meant that when government or a local government was designing a service, if that service was not accessible, they did not receive funding for it. So it's, we can have all of the policies and standards that we like, but whether with the best of intentions or not, sometimes those are not followed through. So if you tie it to funding in that kind of strong way, that's the stick, and then we have the carrot of just generally doing the right thing.
Excellent. Pamela, can you talk about some bold ideas, actions, maybe things that you've heard throughout the day to help enhance digital inclusion in Ontario?
Well, I think I'm going to start with a bit of a bold caution. One of the things, this isn't new to me, but it's been really punctuated and reinforced for me today, is that good intentions aren't enough to deliver inclusive design, right? There are lots of people who mean well and try to do good things, but that's not enough. And the work that we've seen today in terms of the variety of activities people have taken, the range of people who are leading those things, representing different groups, there's different ages, different capacities. What we're seeing is that it's not one size fits all, but just saying I care about this isn't sufficient to actually deliver on it. You have to roll up sleeves, dig in, and really get moving forward. And so I think that's one thing I've seen. I think one of the challenges I noticed today is there's this question of how do we take the amazing work that started and scale it up. There's certainly a scalability piece that's happened, and there's been discussions about public-private partnerships here. That's one mechanism. I'm going to be really looking forward to seeing what the province of Ontario can do in terms of helping expand capacity around digital inclusion. It's also civil society government and civil society private sector partnerships too. So I think we've got lots of bold ideas, and there are more to come tomorrow, but I think it's more about the process by which we move forward right now that really matters.
And when you think of the words of Dory, in terms of the way that things are at OCAD, that's the minimum for them is what, many see as a positive move forward.
And different people are in different places. I mean, OCAD has embraced this agenda and gone forward. Other people are just going to be starting. Other organizations may feel like they're further along. So again, we need more than, there's not going to be one generic solution. They have to emerge from the places that they need to respond to.
Along the same lines, Kylie, did you have any additions or ideas?
Yeah, so I was told before I came to Canada that Canada is a country with too much geography, and I can absolutely recognise that. So I think my point here would be, as it was from my experience in terms of going to those local communities to understand their needs, but not just kind of geographical communities, groups of people. So if we're looking at the previous talk, which I thought was excellent, around women of colour in tech, where are those communities? Can we go to them and actively target them rather than having set quotas? I think there's a good example from the UK. So my own personal experiences in the justice system, and a really exciting thing we did was we worked with an organisation called Code 4000, which teaches prisoners to code. And that obviously hugely increases their chances of employability. But what I quite like about that is reflecting on the disadvantage that many of those people have even before they are put into prison. So, for example, around 70% of people who are incarcerated have grown up at some point in foster care. So it's about recognizing the difference between equality and equity. So equality is giving everyone the same access. Equity is, compensating for the fact that people have started from a much lower base.
A great example. And we'll be compiling a lot of this in our report. I see Megan taking mad notes all there. She's been taking notes all day. So we'll go to Slido for a question. Who in the audience is going to start the civil society organization to lead the charge and build this movement?
Nobody is coming. It's up to us. So we have to be the ones to take this forward, everyone in this room. So I think it's a call to action for all of us, really. So I put that back to the audience. But yeah, I'm absolutely excited to be here in Canada and want to, be involved in that movement. So please personally come and talk to me because I'd love to know more.
One of the things we're finding inside Ryerson when we're tackling this issue of how do we really embrace diversity is there's this question of, what are the assets that you have that you can bring to the table? What's the experience you have that's proven? How can you be open? And it's really a matter of knitting things together. It's like quilt building in a way. And so there will be many people, not just one person in this audience, who we all need to start understanding what people's roles are inside this network and then trying to figure out what the cracks are and then figuring out where the growth is going to come from.
So in terms of the report, actually, we will send it all out to you in draft format. So if you have additions, if you want to add ideas, if you want to expand on what's there, that we would really encourage you all to be a part of that process. I'm going to go to the audience for questions. I think Claude has a microphone. That'll be good. Okay, I'm going to go to Sanal's question online. What are some of the key changes you're looking to make in your role in 2018?
Interesting. So to a point in one of the previous talks about being accountable, I think it's a really good place to start. So working in the open is something we should all be committed to. An example of that would be for your organization, you could commit to publishing your data on diversity so that you can see where you are now and you can measure the work that you're doing to try and improve that. I think in terms of inclusion more broadly, inclusion is not merely the absence of exclusion. It's a significant amount of work for us to do that, but that's our responsibility.
One of the things that we talk a lot about inside Ryerson is how do we use our power as a public institution to share knowledge, both the knowledge that gets generated inside our place, but also as a convener of knowledge. And so we have a School of Continuing Education, for example, that offers a whole range of programming for a really good price point, and it's online, and there are lots of ways to access it, and so we're very mindful of our power both as a convener, but also as a place that's training the next generation of leadership. And so inside our university, but also OCAD and U of T and York and all the other GTA universities, we're taking things quite seriously. All of our institutions have responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're trying very hard to make progress in a way that's meaningful, working with communities of people, not on their behalf. And so I think I'm hopeful in a way that over time, the people that you start to welcome into your organizations will bring new experience and new ideas, but this will be part of what they're used to. The diversity piece will be baked in for them because they've learned in diverse communities of people. They intuitively and instinctively know that their education is better because they learned in a room with people who aren't like them necessarily, and they value diversity as an asset, not just as a thing that needs to happen. And hopefully their leadership will change our institutions from the bottom up over time. But it's hard work, and it's easy to talk about it and much harder to do it, but I feel like we have good intention and we're trying to make good progress, but we also have tons to learn. So
I like the references throughout the day for both the bottom up and the top down, because you need leadership from the top on these issues, and also you need grassroots movement type action. We'll go to a question in the audience.
Hi, everyone. Just have a quick question, because we heard from so many different groups this morning and early afternoon, those who are visually impaired, those for women of color. So I'm kind of wondering what advice you would give to everyone when it's our responsibility to bring everyone to the table for inclusive design. It's a lot of work. I get that, but what advice would you tell us to get us started on these conversations?
Simple one from me, we need to all become experts in the practice of empathy. And that doesn't just mean, bringing people into the conversation as and when we think we should. That means having them there from the beginning. So I think if you can help to quantify that, the value of that to your organization, that's really going to help. So, for example, if you are designing a service, or even if you're in the private sector, if you design that in such a way that it is inclusive, it will be more successful. So we know all of the stats around inclusion and diversity producing better results for companies. So that's just kind of one thing you can talk to. But really on a personal level, it's, talking to and going to those communities. Don't stay in your own world, go to theirs and understand their experiences.
Absolutely, for being at the table. Fantastic message.
I would say that you have to start at the very beginning, and that when you bake in diversity from the outset, you end up with much better outcomes. And so it isn't something you can add on. And I think back to the question we had this morning, one of the questions on Slido was about, I think it was people from the disability community to test my software. And my immediate reaction as a planner was, well, maybe they don't want to tell you they think your software is not a good fit for them. The better design process would have been to have gone, if they were your community of users that you wanted to work with in the first place, to have gone and engaged them and built relationship and trust from the outset to say, okay, I have this idea. Does it resonate? Does this make any sense to you? Is there value in it? If not, what would you suggest? And can we build it together? And so in my experience, when the diversity piece, when you start with it at the nucleus, you have to be attentive to it, but it's much easier than trying to add it on at the end.
So engagement and partnership as opposed to the consultation in the final moments, essentially.
And also just you normalize it. It isn't, that's where you start. Like it isn't even about engaging. It's who's at the table at the very beginning. And for people like me, middle-aged white people with permanent jobs, it's also about getting out of the way, right? And making new spaces. I heard Michelle Obama speak in Montreal on Monday, and one of the things that she said was, if you're serious about diversity and there are a limited number of seats at the table, are you going to give up your chair, get out of the way, and let someone else sit down? And that's a really important thing for those of us who occupy positions of privilege to think about, right? Is about making space and not taking up space too. Yeah.
Excellent. There's a question just at the back. Yes. Pamela, we're just going to wait until you have the microphone. Sorry, I know you're not named Pamela. I didn't think I just called you Pamela.
Sorry, I have kind of a hard question for Pamela, and I'm not intending to be mean, but I'm sure you've seen the Leposki critique of your building at Ryerson, maybe the YouTube video or some of the verbiage. I wondered if you could tell us how that happened, if you have any insights, or I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you might have, like you're in the area, you might know something about it.
I don't know the answer, and I don't know how it happened. And one of the things I wrote down this morning, and I didn't actually really know. I mean, I knew a little bit, but I learned more today about that. And this is, I'm surprised that I didn't know, but I didn't know. And so one of the questions that I wrote down to myself is, how did this happen? Because that building represents so many progressive things, but a really important piece of infrastructure wasn't thought of from the outset and from the design. And so I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry. And I would like to learn, but I'm going to go back and ask. But I will say that it's not a hard question. It's a fair question. We're a public institution. We value equity, diversity, inclusion, and if we're not standing up, then I think those questions are important to raise. So thank you for asking it.
Thank you. Another question over here.
So just picking up on a question that came a couple of minutes ago about how there's lots of different kind of issues that we've highlighted over the course of the day, and I'm glad to hear that you will be coming up with a report. I'm sure the government and Public Policy Forum will be thinking about how do we organize these different pieces of work. 15 different initiatives, how do we collect the ones that make sense? But for someone like me and for many people in the audience, the idea of building empathy is a good starting point, but if you want to think about where do I want to concretely put my time and energy, that's a difficult question. And I guess, and often it kind of, maybe I personally care about a certain issue, Indigenous digital reconciliation, and I'm going to put my effort in there, right? How do we make better decisions about, and how do we organize kind of where resources are most needed? And I'm curious, I guess, like, what advice would the panelists have about how the government should be thinking about this?
I mean, I think if you have a personal interest in something, that's certainly a good place to start. In terms of, focusing your efforts somewhere, one thing I've noticed here is in the Canadian government is the network of kind of diversity and inclusion groups is not as clear as it is in the UK, so I can appreciate how it might be difficult to find some of those spaces. And I don't particularly have much experience here in my 10 days to suggest that. However, I think, follow what you're passionate about, and that's good. And yeah, just kind of educate on maybe some international perspectives. I'm happy to talk to you about that.
I think that, you've got a couple of options. You could put your hand up in the place where you spend your day, or you could go and do things outside of where you spend your day and your time off. And I think they're very different communities of people. I think that, just actually saying out loud, I would really like to be involved in this. If you say it enough, people, you be careful because you may have a flood of people asking you to help. But in my experience in Toronto, people are quite good about connecting you to other people once they know you're interested. And so I think that's a really simple thing that everyone can do here is if people are interested and you can help them make a connection. It's not rocket science, but it does actually help. But I think the other bit is, don't feel like you have to be an expert to participate. It's hard because I don't know you as a person. I'd be happy to talk to you too, but there are so many places that are really welcoming. And I'll use Civic Tech Toronto just as an example. They do this thing which is really simple, but they begin every session with everybody saying their name out loud. I think that's a really powerful thing. Whether there's 25 people there or 102, everyone gets a chance to say who they are and why they came. And that sets the table to say, hi, this is who you are, this is who we are, you're welcome here. And so I think there are lots of ways you could contribute, in small ways and in big ways. But the other piece of this, I think, is that especially in the Truth and Reconciliation piece, Justice Sinclair came to our campus 2 years ago, and one of the things he spoke to us about was he said, if you're a settler, you have to do some homework. Like, you can't keep asking us to teach you the things that you don't know. And that's a very powerful statement, I think. And so even just being learning and going out and engaging are really important steps too.
Are there other questions in the audience? We'll perhaps ask one more question from Slido. When we get down to the conversation around the table tomorrow, where should we start? Very broad question.
I think we start by having the conversation in the open. So lots of people have said this throughout the day, but if we are a group of people in this room, and we can have as many conversations as we like tomorrow. But if we're not having those in a way that other people can engage with, then it's really not going to become a movement and a real drive forward. So kind of play the call to action back to everyone here to make sure that we're talking about this, talking about it online, and talking about it in your own workplaces and communities.
And I think one commitment that people could take from this session, going back to where you spend your daytime or your evenings, is to be committed to sharing something that you learned, and also talking out loud about the things that are challenging and hard. Often we really focus on things that are accomplishable, but so much of this work is going to take time, but it's also going to take really rolling up sleeves, and we're going to stumble. And I think feeling comfortable talking about trying to make progress on these kinds of issues is important, because then it reminds everybody else that lots of us are trying to figure it out as we go. So keeping the conversation going and taking it back to where you spend your time is also really important, both at home and at work or at school or in the communities in which you volunteer.
I think I would just add one point to that, which is that we need to be prepared to talk about things that are slightly uncomfortable. And if we have to acknowledge where there are disparities and inequity, and talk about that. Otherwise, it's not going to move forward. So, yeah, that's my recommendation.
And some of this work will take time too. I mean, you have to be uncomfortable for a long time sometimes. And I'm very mindful of not exporting my discomfort to other people. Like, that's my thing to work through. But I think we need to own that in a way, because we're all part of this system. I mean, you came here, you could have been anywhere else on a Friday. I think there's a commitment to moving forward, but the discomfort piece is really important, but sometimes it's longer than I'm going to fix that by lunchtime. So, yeah.
If anyone can fix it by lunchtime, please let us know.
The food was great, though. Can we just clap for how good the lunch was here? I have to say, yeah. Can I also say one more thing? Can I also just thank our sign language interpreters for, this is such a big... When we have our convocation, I always think, my goodness, like, trying to do all those names is really hard, but there are so many big ideas here, and I think, the sign language is evolving, but I really admire their capacity to animate this conversation and make it wider and more accessible to people, so thank you very much.
I hope you exaggerated that thanks a bit.
With a pat on the back, too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Pamela, I could pass you over all my other thanks if you want.
Sorry, I'm stealing the show.